So, hello and welcome to our HEAS talk, today's HEAS talk by Professor Jane Kershaw. We welcome you all, and also we welcome the audience which is at home at the laptops or at the computers to listen to our talk. First, we have to apologize for this short term change of the room, but I'm quite lucky that the information of the new room all reached you in time, and it's a very impressive to have this full lecture room here, which shows that there is much interest on this topic. I just want to give you a first short brief introduction to our today's lecturer, and then we will immediately begin. Mrs. Kershaw studied archaeology and modern history at the University of Oxford, where she also received the Gibbs and the Arnold Prize for her work there. She also is was in that case a Kennedy Scholar at the Harvard University. From 2011 to 2017, she was British Academy Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the UCL, and from 2017 to 2019, she was Leverham Early Career Fellow at the Institute for Archaeology in Oxford. From 2019 to 2024, she received her ERC starting grant, Silver and the Origins of the Viking Age. We will hear about this today. And since 2025, she's Gard Rousing Associate Professor of Viking Age Archaeology at the University of Oxford. Mrs. Kershaw's career is marked by significant academic recognition. As we heard, she got the Leverham Prize, and this is a very important prize because it allowed her to do large-scale excavations at East Thurston. Is it? I did my best. It's very interesting because the excavations, this money allowed her to excavate at this place where we find a Viking Age winter camp, which is associated with Anglo-Saxon industrial activity, which is very interesting. She is specialized in early medieval Northern Europe with particular focus on Viking Age societies and their Byzantine and Islamic connections. And within this, she did and does large-scale analytical analysis on metals using stylistic, spatial, metallurgical, and isotopic methods. Her recent ERC-funded work focus on the connection to the Islamic world. And within this, which is, for example, very interesting, she uncovered some new Islamic mining sites, or which at least point to them. Mrs. Kershaw is also doing extensive teaching in the University of Oxford, University of Cambridge, and the UCL. And with this, I'm done with my introduction. I just want to ask you, please turn off your mobile phones, and I give the word to Jane.
Thank you very much. Do I need to turn on this? It's automatic. Thank you very much indeed. That's a very warm introduction indeed. Thank you to everybody who's made my trip to Vienna run so smoothly. And what I wanted to do today is talk about a recent ERC starting grant project that finished a few months ago, all about how and where the Viking Age began. And it's using geochemistry, the analysis of Viking Age silver objects, to tell us about that important question. I am based at the University of Oxford. This is the School of Archaeology on a summer's day. And what I thought I'd just do is talk you through the whole project, how I came up with the idea, some of the initial trials that we did, some of the challenges that we faced, because these things never go as planned, and what the results were and how they change our perceptions, not just of the start of the Viking Age, but really who the Vikings were. We think of them as sort of violent raiders going out pillaging, taking treasure from neighboring Western economies. And that is true, but it's only part of the picture. So I hope to challenge that stereotype to some extent. And really the question is about Viking origins. I mean, we know that the Viking Age was impactful. We're talking roughly about 750 to 1050, so it's a period of 300 years or so. Lots of Viking raids from the Scandinavian homelands going out especially to the UK, Ireland, the northern continent. These were very disruptive. It leads to the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. The Vikings also, though, settle new lands as far away as Newfoundland and Ukraine. And these also provide catalysts to urbanization in these countries and to state formation. So the impact of the Vikings is understood, but the question that remains is, how does it all begin? And this is a question, this is just a selection of the many articles from the last 30, 40 years or so that have addressed this question. And there are many more. Because it's a very difficult one to get at. At the moment, it's quite heavily informed by the written sources, particularly for Western Europe, things like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Frankish Annals. They depict, they mention the very heavy raids, the relentless nature of these raids, particularly in the 9th century. But really, the most famous one is the attack on Lindisfarne in 793. And Lindisfarne is on the northern English coast up here. This is an arrow rather than a thing, but maybe you can see that. And these raids generate lots of silver in the hands of the Vikings. So we hear in the annals the amount of silver in weights that the Vikings acquire through these raids. So £26 to begin with, that's just an early sort of testing ground, but the numbers soon go up: £7,000, £5,000, £6,000, sometimes alongside other forms of wealth like grain and livestock. They're often ransoming people. Abbot Louis was fortunate because he was ransomed back in exchange for silver, but plenty of other people were not. And so it makes sense that this is this is sort of fits the image of the Vikings, I think. We do also know about an Eastern Viking expansion that goes from sort of central Sweden, the area of Birka. It would head across the Baltic into northern Russia, and it would go down either the Dnieper River and also further east along the River Volga. And they're meeting Islamic merchants who are coming up from the Islamic Caliphate, and they're meeting in these middle places to acquire Islamic silver in the form of silver coins or dirhams. And what they're exchanging are forest products, furs, other things, amber potentially, but also slaves. So slavery is certainly an aspect of this, and we know this from written sources. Perhaps one of the most famous is Ibn Fadland, who's an emissary from Baghdad, and he travels and he meets a group known as Rus. These are Vikings in some form. Have they adopted local cultural habits? Possibly. But he describes a group of Rus bringing their boat up onto the shore, putting up a carved wooden idol. And he says, they pray to this idol. They say, "Oh Lord, I've come from a far away country. I have with me such and such a number of young slave girls, such and such a number of sable skins. Do me the favor of sending me a merchant who has a large quantity of dirhams and who will buy everything I want and will not argue with me over price." So we have these written accounts, and this is not the only one. We also have the archaeological evidence for dirham hoards, and they're very extensive, as this map shows. In particular, the island of Gotland here is awash with dirhams, but you can see they're sort of coming into southern Sweden as well. And now, I think this is based on slightly old data. Now we've got more from the UK as well. But these dirhams are mostly 10th century in date. And it's thought that before 900, the amounts reaching Scandinavia were not especially significant. So after 900, the most common dynasty that's minting dirhams are the Samanids, and they're the grey, the ones that you see here in grey. So the majority of dirhams in hoards in Sweden, which is the top diagram, in Norway, which is the lower diagram, are made up of these Samanid dirhams. Abbasid coins, Umayyad coins, which are earlier, are rarer. And because Islamic coins stay in circulation, they're not withdrawn when new issues are minted. There's also the possibility that these older coins could reach Scandinavia after 900. But in general, there's a consensus based on surviving coins, is based on the archaeological records, that Islamic silver trickles in around 800. It increases after about 860, but really it's from 900 onwards that we see the floods of coins. And this has led to these sort of common beliefs about where and what and when the Viking Age began. So it's seen primarily as a westward expansion. First, the Vikings go west, they raid Britain and Ireland and the continent. Thereafter, sort of the silver wealth that's readily available in coinage. And that this happens in the mid-9th century. The Eastern expansion is a later and independent event. So I wasn't entirely happy with this sort of state of the art, if you like. And one of the things that struck me was this incredible burial off the Estonian island of Saaremaa in Salma. The publication of this is new, it's just out. It was discovered in 2010, and it contains, there were 2 clinker-built boats, one for rowing, one possibly sailing, which would be quite an early use of the sail. And it contained the remains of 41 men, 4 of whom were brothers, we know from ancient DNA. And the men were found stacked. The excavator describes them as being stacked like firewood on top of each other. They showed evidence for violence and for quite brutal deaths. Carbon 14 points to a date in the mid-8th century for this whole burial. But a selection of the skeletons, I think it's 8 of the individuals, have also been analysed for carbon, strontium, oxygen isotopes, which gives their childhood origins as central Sweden, which also fits with the stylistic evidence that they have from their weaponry, which they were buried with. So here, around 750, we have a group of heavily armed Swedes, people originally from modern-day Sweden, heading eastwards across the Baltic. And it's decades before the Viking attacks on Lindisfarne. Now, we don't know what their purpose was, but this is the route that the Eastern trading route would eventually come into. And so I thought this was interesting, and this was sort of unexpected given what we know of the traditional Viking expansion. At the same time, I was aware when I was going to the Museum of the National Museum in Denmark that there were increasing finds made through metal detectors. And these included finds from settlements, which seemed to have evidence of 9th century activity. And they were getting lots of fragmented dirhams, which is quite unusual. In hoards, dirhams can be whole. The Samanid ones are often whole. We're getting really heavily fragmented dirhams. But because they're fragmented, people couldn't identify them. We couldn't read the inscriptions on them. The ability to read the Arabic script is a really specialist skill, sort of combined with the numismatic skill. And it's one of only a handful of people are able to do this in Europe. So it's quite specialist. So I was aware of these sort of increasing number of coins, and also these settlements had cast silver artifacts, and we didn't really know where the silver was coming from. And there was one more problem with this scenario, which was that there was a real disconnect between the historical sources and the archaeology when it came to the presence of Western European silver in Scandinavia. You would think that if they're doing all this raiding, they're acquiring the silver, you'd find lots of Carolingian coinage, Anglo-Saxon coinage in Scandinavia, but you don't. I think the number of Anglo-Saxon coins is something like 12. It's a bit healthier when it comes to Carolingian coinage because it's 330, still not very many at all. And the date of this coinage is surprising because it dates to the first half of the 9th century, and actually the period between 820 and 840, which is before the raids really intensify. In Denmark, many of these coins come from a site called Havsmarken, which is on the island of Aro, which is quite near to Hedeby. And it's quite clear that this site is a big trading center. It has around 80 of the 230 Islamic coins from Denmark, but these coins are whole. And the general feeling is that this is a trading site. These are Carolingian coins that are coming in through trade. They're quite physically close to the Carolingian world. This is not stuff that is arriving by raiding activity. There has been a belief that the reason Western European coinage doesn't survive is that it's been melted down by the Vikings to create rings and ingots. And so I thought maybe that's something that could be tested. So I felt like silver, sort of analyzing the silver in new ways, had potential to ask new questions, to probe new questions about the Viking Age. The Viking Age is known as the Age of Silver because there are many hundreds of silver hoards deposited from this region, from this time period, often rings, ingots, sometimes whole, sometimes cut up. The Vikings like silver because it's an alternative form of wealth to land and to cattle, which would have been the most important form of wealth in Scandinavia at this time. But it's really versatile. You can wear big silver neck rings, you can display your wealth, but then you can also cut those up and use bits of silver as payment pieces. You can melt the whole thing down, recast them into ingots to store wealth for the long term. It's easy to pass on and divide. So it's very versatile. And luckily for archaeologists, there's also quite a lot of it, and it's accessible in museums across Northern Europe. So I felt like I wanted to harness this evidence in some way. And that was always going to be through geochemistry because the Viking silver artifacts, the rings and the ingots, they are all made from imported silver. So Scandinavia does have silver mines now, but those were not exploited in the Viking Age. And so all the silver has to come from abroad in some form or other. And we know from the way the hoards that are preserved that there are two main sources of coinage. One is Islamic silver, and the other, albeit in very small numbers, is Western European silver. Some people have asked me, do I think there's any old Roman silver that is still in circulation at this time that could go into Viking objects? And I think that no, there isn't, at least not in a significant or systematic way. The last Roman coins in Western Europe were minted around 400. The Byzantine Empire has a real reduction in silver over the course of the 7th century. And we know, because we've now done the analysis, we didn't know at the start of the project, but we do know now that both these sorts of coinage, the Western European coinage and the Islamic coinage, are made from freshly mined silver themselves, that with local silver sources. So the Western coinage is made largely with silver from the mine of Mel in Western France, and the Islamic coinage comes from regional ore sources, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. And so these coins don't preserve any old Roman metal, and neither do the Viking silver objects, I would argue. And so I wanted to do some geochemical work on the silver. At the start of this, I was thinking about this in 2018 or so, there wasn't really a lot of reference data to go on. There had been some early research papers by Metcalfe and Northover looking at Anglo-Saxon and Carolingian coinage, which have provided some data for the elemental compositions of this work, which was quite, they were valuable, mostly done by EPMA. And Guillaume Serra in Orléans also said, generously gave us some of the data that he was working on for Carolingian coinage. But then there was also this thesis by Stephen Merkel, completed in 2014 but published in 2016, looking at silver from the Viking Age site of Hedeby, which in the Viking Age was part of Denmark but is now in Schleswig. And he was mostly looking at the 10th century coins, but he had also some 9th century Islamic dirhams and their imitations. And this provided the first lead isotope data for this material, which showed that it was quite distinctive. And he also had some Anglo-Saxon silver in there as well. And the two isotope groups were quite different. And I thought, oh, this could really be something. It's difficult when we're using geochemistry to work out silver provenance. Lead isotope analysis is not always something that is going to work. But in this case, we're dealing with two sources and only two sources, candidate sources of silver. And these sources are not close to each other. They're quite far apart geographically, and I hoped geochemically as well. And those sources are made of freshly mined silver in themselves. So they are not going to be made of recycled silver. The aim here was never to identify the ores that the silver was coming from. It was always to identify the flow of metal and to work out how that metal is circulating, what is going into the melting pots in Scandinavia to cast these silver items in the 9th century. So I was able to put together this sort of early reference data set, which just shows simply that the Western European coinage and the Islamic coinage, they're different in terms of their lead isotopes. So the Islamic coinage is in blue. The crosses are the actual coins that we had data for, and the squares are the source ores where we thought they came from. So that's for the Islamic coinage, that's mostly ores in Iran, which was a big source we later found out. And the Western coinage, we started off with quite a broad group. We included Anglo-Saxon galena, silver-bearing galena in here, although we now think that is not a source of silver, but that it was mostly coming from Mel. So we had this early reference data, and we were allowed to try it out. I can't quite believe we were given permission for this, but we were. So this incredible hoard was found in Bedale, which is in North Yorkshire, in 2012. And it contains an amazing, very large ingots, lots of them. An incredible torque is the only way to describe this item, made of 3 strands, of which are themselves plated or twisted together. Various other forms of armring here. This is a distinctive Hiberno-Scandinavian armring, so a type made in Dublin. And in addition to all this, the golden hilt of an Anglo-Saxon sword with Anglo-Saxon true Hiddle style decoration. And we were able to sample all of the silver in this. I got a grant to do isotope work with the British Geological Survey, which is in Nottingham, in the UK. And this is Jane Evans, who took the actual samples. We were allowed to drill, actually, this silver hoard, but you only need tiny, tiny amounts of silver. This is the amount of silver we needed, and it's 1 milligram. So it is really small. Of course, we don't want to damage the silver, the objects in any way. Now, what we would do later on in the project is take this silver, divide it in two, use half for lead isotope analysis and half for elemental analysis. In these early stages, I hadn't quite got that method down, and I ended up doing solution work for lead isotope analysis And I also wanted to look at elements which I did with laser ablation. Now, lead isotopes, of course, relate to the original ore source in principle. And the elements, we were really interested in gold and bismuth. Gold, they both relate to the original host ore, and they both withstand melting down and refining. So they ought not to change very much. Gold really doesn't change as the silver is processed. Bismuth is very difficult to remove as well. So these were going to be quite indicative and really helpful for us in order to try to discriminate between different sources. So we ended up doing laser ablation for the elements, also in Nottingham. So here, because we really wanted to get at the core of the metal, not just the surface. So we ablated for about, I think it's about 200 seconds in all, but it's time resolved. So we only take the readings after about 5 seconds. I think between 5 and 75 seconds were the readings that we took. And we also did everything by PXRF, which showed us that we could not rely on PXRF, especially for gold. It massively overestimates the amount of gold that is contained within here, but in an unpredictable way. So it wasn't very helpful for us. We did actually do we got XRF data for all the objects we analysed, but we couldn't really use it in a quantitative way. It was fine. It was okay for other elements. For bismuth, it was fine, but for gold, it wasn't, because if the silver is leached from the surface, it's going to artificially enrich the gold layers that are on the top of the silver. And that's what the XRF is presumably picking up. And these were the lead isotope results we got from the Beedale hoard. And the main thing was I was just relieved that it plotted on the reference data. It could have been all over the place, but no, I was pretty happy with how it plotted. And we originally thought that this was all sort of Western European silver, and this was all Islamic silver. It's broadly true, but nowadays I would say that this is probably silver that's been refined, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But anyway, it's a good fit. And also the elemental composition seemed to map onto the lead isotope groups. So Islamic dirhams are lower in gold than Western European coinage. And so when we had the lead isotope groups, we could see that actually maps on quite nicely. The MEL here is the Western European coins, along with English coins, English lead, and those are higher in gold, but lower in bismuth. So gold and bismuth seem to be differentiated between the lead isotope groups. And there's a mixture group, because there's no reason why Viking metal casters would have separated Islamic dirhams and Western European coinage. There's every chance they're going into the melting pot together, which we recognize. And so we thought we could also see a group that shared characteristics of both. Okay, and so with that Beedale, that was sort of my test case, and that's how I was able to write the ERC starting grant. It's quite a small group. It was just myself, and I definitely wanted Stephen Merkel to be involved because his work at Hedeby was really important, and he agreed to be, which was great. And we also had Jani Oravisieri from Finland, who was identifying Islamic dirhams for us. That's a separate strand to the project, which I'm not going to talk about too much about here. But really, you needed this combination, I think, in order to make the project work. The first thing we had to do was build a reference data set. We had some coins already, but it's not enough. So we did our own analysis, particularly on dirhams. We felt we had the Western European coins, they're not really varied that much. They all came from a sort of limited geographical space. Islamic dirhams, they come from all over the place. So we had to measure their lead isotopes. We did that partly through laser. Sometimes we took physical samples as well, and these are the different mints that we surveyed. They reflect the mints that are most common in Viking Age graves. But we had a problem because the dirhams, they're really diverse. So dirhams minted in Iran are made from Iranian ore. those minted in Central Asia are made from ore in Central Asia. Those minted in Baghdad are made from ore in the Taurus Mountains, and nobody knew that before before we started this project. And that was a problem. I mean, it was great to find out, but it's also a problem because you can't take any single dirham and measure it against a Viking silver object, because each Viking silver object is going to be made of tens of dirhams, right? So we had to find a way of accounting for that recycling, of modeling recycling. So what we did is that we recognized that the composition of dirham hoards in Scandinavia changes over time, reflecting the sorts of dirhams that they're getting in Scandinavia. So it starts off, they're getting a lot of Sasanian and Umayyad dirhams. These are the earliest. There's then a period of lots of Abbasid coins. And after 900, you're getting lots of Samanid coins, which are the pink. So it changes over time. That makes sense. So we took our actual analyses of dirhams that we had and we modeled them. We said, okay, take this hoard from Gotland. What would the isotopes be if we melted down all the dirhams in that hoard? What would that look like isotopically? We did that for around 15 hoards from Gotland and Erland, and we came out with this model. The uncertainties are on here because we got a lot of the dirham data through laser ablation. I'm just going to remove it just for clarity. But the dirham hoard composition changes over time, and particularly between the first half of the 9th century and the second half of the 9th century. And this was going to be really important for us because when we came to analyze the Viking silver objects, we saw that actually a lot of them fit with this early 9th century pattern, which is when dirhams are meant to be a trickle, right? We appreciate that Viking silver is heavily recycled, so we were aware of that. Our one further issue we had to face, and I'll just talk about this before I come on to the results, is cupellation. Silver can also be refined to remove the impurities in it, and you want fine silver. The Vikings wanted fine silver. And when you do that and you add lead to silver, you heat it, and the base metals will react with the lead, it'll form a litharge, and then that can be removed, leaving fine silver. And when you do that, the lead that you add to the silver is going to imprint its isotopes onto the silver. And what you'll end up with is the lead, and it'd be completely unrelated to the original silver. That's potentially quite a big problem. So we had to be really alert to that. So we were quite careful that wherever we sampled silver, we also sampled lead because we needed to evaluate has cupellation taking place. And we made the assumption, and it is an assumption, that the lead was going to be locally sourced. So you're not going to get lead from the Islamic Caliphate. It's going to be from Northern Europe somewhere. So we're sampling a lot of lead. We saw that lead from York, for instance, was sourced from the North Pennines, which made sense, but again, hadn't been done before. So we really sort of had to be aware of that. Okay, so we're at the stage where we had these reference material. You've got different compositions, different lead isotopes. And to test this, we have a very Eastern artifact type, a Permian arm ring, because it's made in the area of Perm in Russia. And we wanted to test, is our model of dirham silver, does it hold up? And I think it does. So the yellow triangles are Permian arm rings. We would expect that this Eastern artifact type is made entirely of dirham silver that's traveling up through Russia. And it seems to hold. So we were happy with that. And then we also had different levels of gold and bismuth in the coinage, especially the Islamic coins had lower gold than the Western European coins. It was a bit more subtle than that. I won't dwell there, but we realized later that there was a chronological dimension here, and that some early Western coins are actually lower in gold than we had appreciated, but still not as low as Islamic coinage. So our actual sampling, we looked at 300 items of silver in these locations. We had hoped to do more in Denmark originally, but it was COVID years, so we ended up doing more in the UK than we had planned. So we have 300 items of Viking Age silver, but we also have all this. This is reference data, other things that we sort of analysed along the way. It's all available if it's useful to anyone. We're very happy to share the data. It will all be going up onto the Archaeological Data Service in due course as well. And I thought I'd just take you through some of the major results region by region. Starting with the East, these are some of the methods that we used. It's a mix of solution work and also laser ablation, and really fun, portable laser ablation, where you take the laser into the museum, you ablate the material, collect it on Teflon filters, and you can then dilute that in solution and process the samples in a really high resolution way. That's good because you don't have to annoy the curators by getting them to bring the artifacts to you. You can go into the museum. It's minimally destructive and you get the high precision. So this was Gareth Davies had developed it in Amsterdam, and we were really pleased to be able to use that as well. So I'll come on to the results. The three main discoveries that we had is that we see Islamic silver in all the areas that we surveyed, even in areas that are further west in the Scandinavian lands, where we would have thought that Western silver played more of an important role. We saw that with the Bedale hoard, and that seems to be true in general. But this Islamic silver, it's not just general silver, it's early in date. It's arriving in Scandinavia, I would say, before 850. And we do see Western silver as well. We have been able to identify it, but it's not in huge amounts. And I suspect it's coming in. It's like the Louis the Pious coins that have been found in Denmark. It's earlier than the main period of raiding. And so I think it's probably coming in through trade and being mixed with dirhams. So it's not proper loot. So we analysed this material from Öland, and we had other things from the island of Gotland as well. This is very much the starting point. Eastern Scandinavia is the starting point for the expeditions to the east. I would have expected that it's all Islamic silver coming from these areas, and it does seem to be. So again, the yellow triangles are the items that we analysed. So it's a relatively small number from these two places. And it correlates with the Islamic, the models. These are models. These are not actual analyses. Remember that it's the modelled dirham silver. And it seems to really fit with this early group rather than the later group going into the second half of the 9th century, even though these hoards were deposited around 900. So the silver is old and it's circulating for a long time. We also went to Denmark. We did lots of artifacts from settlement sites. I didn't want to just look at hoards. And so these are some of the items we were able to sample, lots of cut up pieces of silver. So lots more data here. And we see both lead isotope groups represented. So in terms of the dirham silver, we do get these later hoards as well. But we're also seeing a lot of this early 9th century Islamic silver contained in the cast artifacts. These are settlement finds, so they don't have a TPQ like the hoards do usually. So yeah, the dating is less precise with these. We do see two other things. One is a few artifacts around here which don't correlate with anything. As I'll show in another slide, that I think is lead. I think it's lead coming from England to Denmark that's been used to refine the silver. When that happens, you can't tell what the origin of the silver was. But Islamic silver is really fine, and there's very little chance that purely Islamic silver would be coupled. in this way. So it's at least got to have some Western European coinage in it, which is fine, but can go through periods of debasement. Or it's a mixed group and they don't know what the silver is. But it's unlikely to be purely Islamic silver, I think. And then we also have this Western group here. So we are seeing Western European silver. When we looked at the gold content, it didn't really match on to what we thought we would see. The gold is actually not that dissimilar between the Western and the Islamic silver. And it actually goes back to this sort of chronological development, which is that you see this gold profile in quite early Western European coins, like the Louis the Pious coins that are minted between 820 and 840. So this is typical of the sorts of silver that's in Denmark, we think. So it's not the same thing that's coming in as loot. It's an earlier wave of imported silver. The West Coast Cumbria hoard in Bekermet. So this is looking across the Irish Sea. And again, we were able to sample all of this. And again, it looks pretty Islamic. Again, we see this clustering with the early Islamic silver. Not much Western European silver, but here's the lead. A few items, these 3 items, I think, have been refined prior to casting. And so what we're picking up is the lead. That lead comes from Mendips, it comes from Derbyshire, but a really important source is the North Pennines. The fact that Scandinavia doesn't reveal a lot of refined silver suggests that refining isn't a systematic problem for us in terms of interpreting our results. It doesn't seem to be very common. And the Netherlands, right? So this is where we see the boundaries of the Islamic silver flow. I don't really think it's penetrating the continent that much. Here, we see a regular selection of Viking artifacts. This hoard came from it was an island of Wieringen up here. But the isotope results are actually quite different. We do see some Islamic silver. It's up here. But actually, the majority of the items plot down here, not actually with this Carolingian coinage, which we might expect given that it's found on the continent. It's Anglo-Saxon coins that seem to be the better fit, which is quite interesting. That's unexpected, but there was a lot of movement between England and the continent at that time, and it's very possible that Anglo-Saxon coins are in Viking hands. The objects are cast and they travel with the Vikings before being deposited in the Netherlands. So there, here we do, this is proper loot, I think. But there's not many hoards from the continent. There's just 2, actually. Whether that's because they don't have metal detecting, or whether that's because there's a genuine lack of silver being deposited in the Viking Age, I think is an open question. But where we do have this pattern of loot, we don't have very many hoards. So I think that's quite telling. So I would say that there are 2 main insights from the silver analysis that we've done. The first is that the Eastern silver is very important. We see Islamic silver contributing in all areas, even in Western contexts of Viking settlements, where we would expect it's local silver that the Vikings are meant to be extracting that is melted down and made into Viking artifacts. We normally think of the Vikings as taking wealth out. We don't expect them to be bringing it with them and depositing it in the ground, but that's what it looks like is happening here. And it's the early date of this silver as well. The dirham silver looks like it's being deposited. It's reaching silver in very high numbers before 850, where we don't have many surviving dirham coins themselves. And one possibility for this is that the initial flow of dirhams gets melted down because people haven't yet developed a coin mentality towards these coins, and they're treated as just a source of silver rather than being valued as coins. And I think the greater the number of dirhams that flow in, that mindset changes and they start being preserved in their original form as coins with greater frequency. We do also see Western silver, but its quantities are limited. And because of the gold levels, I think it probably predates the main period of raiding. Which is interesting because it suggests not only do we have very few Carolingian coins surviving in Scandinavia, but it's also not present in the cast silver artifacts. The implication being that actually these numbers of pounds of silver that the written sources describe as being acquired by the Vikings in their raids has been massively exaggerated. There could be explanations for that. It could be that the chroniclers are describing the value of things rather than the amount of silver itself. So cows valued at 3,000 pounds of silver, for instance. But there are also references in the same chronicles to people weighing out bits of silver and testing the silver. So at least, a decent amount of it will have been silver itself. And it's quite difficult to avoid the conclusion that the accounts in the chronicles are just clearly exaggerated. They're written by clerics who might well feel unhappy about having to pay out tribute payments to these marauding Vikings. And so as sort of in grievance, they exaggerate the amount of silver that people have to pay out. But it does suggest that the impact of the raids in Europe isn't as great as we had thought. So in sum, I'd like to argue from the analysis of the Viking silver that the Vikings have extensive connections to the East at the very beginnings of the Viking Age. There must have been an established trade in furs and in slaves at the very beginning of the Viking expansion. And it's this Eastern silver that really draws the Vikings out of Scandinavia. And the question that I have that remains is really about the links between this Eastern expansion and the Western one. Is the Western expansion somehow a reaction of those that are furthest removed from the inflow of Eastern silver to try and find their own sources of silver closer to home? The silver is coming into Eastern Scandinavia, but it's Norwegians on the West Coast that are the first ones to raid Britain. They're the ones that are sort of furthest away from the Eastern silver. And so I wonder if there's some sort of way we can connect the expansion eastwards and the expansion westwards through this sort of approach. That's it. Thank you very much for listening.